In the last chapter, we talked about loops. And in this chapter, we'll be talking about something that uses one of the kinds of data types we talked about, the array, and loops. So in this chapter, we'll be discussing arrays and how they work and how we can work with them. So let's get right into it. To start off, we'll be discussing the basics of arrays. So let's say in our program, we are managing a list of names. So we're going to have var name1. One is going to be Bob. We're going to have name2 equals, I don't know, John. And name3 is going to be Walter. So what if we had in our system a bunch of names, say 100 or 1,000 names? Even like this, just writing even 3 names can be a little tedious, like having var, but then having name1, name2, name3, writing those over and over again. So it would help if we could just reference each name by number from a sort of list. So instead of accessing each thing like name1, name2 to get John, Bob, and Walter, we could have them all sort of grouped into one sort of set of elements, set of values. So that's what an array is, a sequence of data values, or elements as we call them. So to make an array in JavaScript, we just do the following. We declare an array, let's call it name list, and then we write square brackets. This indicates that we're going to be writing an array. We're writing an array. And inside this, we have our values. So now we're going to let's make a new sort of list. Instead of having 3 variables, name1, name2, name3, we're going to have everything stored in one single array, a sort of set. So we're going to have Hank, Jesse, and Walter. And each element is separated by a comma. So now we have 3 pieces of data grouped into one set. And they're treated together as a set. Now, we can also create an array without using square brackets. To do that, we would create an array object. We'll be talking about objects in one of the next chapters, so don't worry about that. Just know we'll be using a new operator, the new operator. I think we've seen this before when we worked with dates back in the switch case section in chapter 3, I believe. So you make a new this means you're making a new object and you call it array. Array is actually an object in case you didn't know, because in JavaScript everything is based off of objects and an array is not an exception. So we make an array object by calling new array. This is basically equivalent of what's happening above. I prefer the variant above because I like to think of an array as a separate entity, because in other programming languages, objects aren't necessarily arrays. Arrays aren't necessarily objects, but rather they're a set of elements, separate elements, while an object is considered a unit of various attributes, which we'll talk about in the coming chapters, so don't worry about that. All right, so these are 2 ways to make an array. And another way to make an array is actually we can have it written on multiple lines. JavaScript is pretty lenient in this way, so let's just call it multi-line. So we can write an array, we open our square brackets, and we can write it like this. And oftentimes it's good practice to write like a set of data with multiple lines, because you might have a lot of data and it's actually kind of easy to read this way. It might take up more space, but in text editing that doesn't really matter. So Mark and I don't know, Charlie. And one last thing, the last element in the set of elements does not have a comma, while each element is separated by a comma. So we have the first element, comma, second element, comma, third element, comma, and the final element does not have a comma after it. So just keep that in mind. Of course, we use a semicolon. Okay, so now that we created arrays, how do we access these names? Well, remember how I said before that we could access the names list by a list number? Well, maybe I didn't say that actually, but now I am, so here we go. So we're going to do just that. So we're going to have basically here, each element is identified in an array by an index number. So this one would start with 0 because arrays are 0 inclusive. So this is the 0. This is Hank is at index 0, Jesse's at index 1, and Walter's at index 2. So when we're accessing elements in an array, just keep in mind that you should think of it as 0 inclusive, and the last element is n minus 1, where n is the length of the array. So here, let's write an example. So we're going to take this first name list example, and we're going to say console log. We're going to say name list. And now with the name of the variable of the array, the name of the array, you put square brackets after it. That means we're accessing an index in the array. So with that, let's write 0. This will give us Jesse. This will give us Hank. And let's actually run that. So let me open the index HTML. And you will see, whoops, that's full screen. Get Hank, that's the first element, the 0th element. And 1 would get Jesse. Let's see that. And 2, if we write 3 from name list, it gets undefined because, well, there is no number 3 index. That's technically the 4th element. So, but when we write 2, you get Walter, the last one. Okay, so moving on. In JS, we can access the whole array because arrays themselves are objects. So to do that, we just do this. We just access the name of the variable. That is the array. So name list is going to give us the following. And it says array, that's the type of object, and it says the contents. So we can do the same for name list 2. You get the same result. Whoops. What is it called? Names list. Let me delete that S. Cancel. You see we get the same sort of situation. And the multi-line one should work as well. And there you go. So everything checked out. So these are all valid arrays. So this information we just saw actually might be a little too technical for the user, so you don't literally want to print out array and the square brackets and the elements. We often, in any kind of application, we often present the data as the string itself or the data element itself. We never really want the whole array displayed like this because that's really too technical for users. So what we do for that, we often access element by element. And for that, we need to use some sort of iteration, some sort of looping. Or we could use direct access like we did here, like if you remember, with the square brackets, like we directly access an element. But if you want to access all the elements, say in a list, to make something look like this in the console or on our web page, we need to use a for loop or any other kind of loop. Typically, we use a for loop because it kind of just fits with the array. So first, I want to show you that. So actually, let me write out the for loop. So we have a for loop. And if you remember this from the last chapter, I talked about using iterating through characters of a string. Well, you could actually think of a string as an array of characters, in a sense. Well, in JavaScript, strings are their own thing. But anyway, usually they're an array of characters. So strings can be accessed like an array. But here we're working with arrays. So let's make a for loop that accesses an array. So it's going to iterate through an array. All right, so here we go. We're going to write names. We're going to use multi-line, actually. Multi-line. So what this is doing, we're going to access the array called multi-line. We're going to go from the 0th element to the length, and you're going up to the length -1 element. So let's see that. We're going to do console log multiline, and then in parentheses I. So what we're doing, it's going to print out multiline 0, multiline 1, up to the end. So let's add another element. Let's use, I don't know, I'm just thinking of random names. I don't know, Robert. Okay, there we go. So what we're going to see here now is all the elements printed out by themselves, as if they were independent elements. And oftentimes we would do this if we want to have something displayed in a table. Arrays are often used with like databases and tables, and to be just something to be displayed in a table, I mean. And usually we have arrays to store certain values that are related in a series, so we can just access the array itself instead of finding the independent variables and independent values. And arrays are an efficient way to actually accomplish that. So you will, in your programming experience, you'll probably, in your programming life actually, you'll often see arrays used. So you should actually learn to use them. Excuse me. So let me talk about this a little. This is a property of an object, .length. We'll be talking about properties of objects in the object chapter on objects, but here we often use .length to get the length of a string or get the length of the array, because we often don't know in advance, or we don't want to count. We don't have to say 1, 2, 3. We just say, okay, instead of counting manually the elements in the array, and if we don't know the size of elements in the array, the number of elements in the array, or if it's huge, we basically just call .length. So that's a property. This works with strings and arrays. Okay, so now let's move on and talk about the contents of an array, the array a little bit more. So basically, JavaScript is pretty lenient with its data types, as I've said before. It often converts like numbers to strings and strings to numbers when needed, and that can be kind of confusing. However, with this sort of leniency, we can use this to our advantage. For example, in arrays, in other programming languages, you have to have all the elements of the same type. However, in JavaScript, you do not have to have this. You can have each element to have a different type. So let's actually do that. Let's declare an array. Let's call it mixed array. Initialize the array. So here we're going to make an array that defines a sort of shape. It's going to be blue. It's going to be a blue rectangle. Excuse me. With the size, with the height 52, and the width 43. So you can see this. I kind of made, this is like an array representing the values of a rectangle. And notice here I used strings and numbers, and this will actually work. So let's do mixed, let's actually use this now in a console log, and we're gonna say, actually we can actually store this to my variable. So let's say str this is a, we're gonna concatenate blue, so mixed array 0, accessing the first element, blue, we're gonna add a space, plus, and mixed array. So I'm applying the elements to a string. So this is gonna say blue rectangle. That's the first string. var string 1 or string 2 equals it is, and we're gonna say here mixed array 2 centimeters wide, and we're gonna add the final element, mixed array 3 plus centimeters high. So what I'm doing here is I am making, here we're gonna add a period here actually. What I'm doing here is I'm applying the elements to a string of some sort to be displayed. So we're gonna have here string 1 plus string 2. So what I'm doing here is that I'm applying the elements inside a string because let's say I'm going to be able to change these. We'll do that in a second. Oops, I missed something. Slide 22. Let's see. I forgot something, didn't I? Oh, I forgot the plus here. There we go. Just be careful with your concatenations. All right, so it actually gave us a full sentence. So let's change this now. We can change it to red. Circle. No, let's use, I don't know. Let's use triangle. Because a circle, that would be an oval actually, So, see, and we can change the numbers as well. Let's change this to 33, and let's just change this to, I don't know, 22.4. And see, by using an array, I can change the contents of other values later by just accessing the element, and I can change whatever contents of the array I want. Arrays are often used in this case to provide some sort of set of data that can be changed by the backend part of the system, where the front end just displays the elements in the array or does something with them, and the array can constantly change. So you might find arrays useful for storing sets of elements to be displayed, which then can be changed later on the backend side and just be displayed again by just accessing the array element and not the value itself. So, and here we don't have to convert anything. Everything's treated as independent values. And with that, I think I've covered all the basics. So next time we'll be discussing the various kinds of operations we can carry out with arrays. And we hope to see you there.